Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to this conference with this rather provocative title. Before we start, I would like to obviously thank all the institutions involved in this project. So this conference is actually organized by the Institute of Philosophy of the Academy of Sciences in Prague. It's a part of my operational program, Amos grant, called ArchConcepts, namely on architecture, links between architecture, theory, and philosophy. So, Ministry of Education, thank you, whatever. We also want to thank Strategie 2021 program for generously funding this conference. And we would like to thank our partner, Viper, who helped us to promote this event. So that's for the institutions. Then I want to obviously thank people. I want to thank all the speakers for coming, some of them from really far away. All my panelists, Jana Sokolová, Linda Zain, will be moderating this event. I want to thank also Irena from Viper for helping me with promoting the event. And all the staff of the Institute who really struggled with the bureaucracy, but we made it happen, so the conference is taking place. I want to just, as a brief announcement, so unfortunately, there will be some last-minute changes. Monika Mitashova, the excellent speaker, fell really sick and is going to the hospital today, so she can't come. So we lost one excellent speaker, and we're really sorry that she's not here. So the first panel will be a bit shorter maybe, but at the same time, I probably steal some of her time because I was last minute trying to extend my talk a little bit to fill up some of the void in the program. So that's it. So the Tafuri panel might be slightly earlier after the coffee break. We'll see how it goes. I'm also supposed to tell you from the site, Camp Praha, that you have a Wi-Fi here if you need, and the password is Karel Prager. And obviously I want to thank the place, Camp Praha, for hosting us for this event. Now let me get finally to my talk. So what I would like to do today is what my intention was to kind of set up the debate. So kind of going back to the events of the 1968, which, or what in France, what in other countries, like for instance, Italy, has been known as the long 1968 because it took actually many years. And to show you how architecture and urban planning schools in students were actually involved in transforming the very field of architectural theory and discourse. So in fact, what is maybe not as a known history is that many architecture and urban planning schools during the 68 became the hotbeds of political contestation. École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, the architecture faculty of the Technical University in Berlin, the architecture schools in Florence, Milan, and Rome. All these institutions were in fact epicenters of political protest and spaces in which radical students combined a clear refusal of capitalist social order with self-management and new non-hierarchical forms of teaching methodologies. Some, like the School of Architecture in Rome, obtained an almost mythological stature due to a violent confrontation between students and police forces on March 1st, 1968, in the so-called Battle of Valle Giulia. In France, on the 8th of May, 1968, students began to occupy the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. They joined the movement that had escalated only a few days earlier during the student occupation of the Sorbonne and their subsequent evacuation by the police. On May 14th, students of École des Beaux-Arts started to use the school's lithography studio and to print posters and pamphlets and created a so-called Atelier Populaire, a studio to print those materials, in which lithography was immediately replaced by serigraphy, enabling quicker reproduction of posters. Although the initial intention of the atelier was to sell posters in order to raise money for the movement, these posters soon ceased to be commodities and became information media only. They were pasted on walls around the city and turned into a real visual identity of May 68. As Kristen Ross pointed out in her book May 68 and Its Afterlives, it was impossible for an art object to remain a commodity, even if this commodity would be at the service of the movement. École des Beaux-Arts had been trying to reform its antiquated education system already since 1963. In 1964, the school even established studios located in the Grand Palais that came to be known as the reformist Groupe C, led by George Candelis, whom you most likely know as one of the architects of the Team 10. Candelis experimented with non-hierarchical forms of teaching, and in fact the reversal of the role between the master and the disciple might even remind us of some of the arguments in Jacques Rancière's 1987 book, The Ignorant Schoolmaster. For instance, in his 1977 autobiography titled Bâtir sa vie, Candelis describes the studio as follows. He says, "I eliminated teaching ex cathedra. Everyone was too free to express their opinion. We explored each case and each problem together. And depending on the moment, I became the student and they became the teachers." Among many other demands, the revolting French students called for the dissolution of the Ordre des Architectes, which is the official licensing body of architecture in France, and for the abolishment of the institution of the Prix de Rome. They called for the integration of the École des Beaux-Arts into university system, for radical reform of architecture education, as well as for solidarity with workers and the abolition of capitalist social order. It is true that later, architecture education really happened to be reformed. On December 6, 1968, a ministerial decree established 5 new unités pédagogiques in Paris and 13 in the regions, which in fact constituted the origin of the present French schools of architecture, La Villette, Malaquais, and so on. And they even left space for a so-called UP6, the 6th unit, which kind of absorbed all the rebellious students. So in fact, since 1968 in France, architecture was not to be a part of the Beaux-Arts system anymore. It was to be taught in those unités, which had very bureaucratic names like, exact sciences and technology, or sensible environment, and so on. And obviously, if you know the history, I mean, for many of you, this is an obvious thing that, in fact, that was the moment where the whole system, the kind of a split between the École Polytechnique and École des Beaux-Arts kind of transformed in France. However, we could say that this educational reform was a mere récupération, or what the French students would call the recuperation of the radical demands of students. And of course, as we all know, the capitalist social order wasn't abolished in France. However, what changed radically was the very meaning of the word architecture and the architectural discourse and knowledge. 1968 created career opportunities for a new generation of young architects, including Antoine Grumbach and Roland Castro and others, who otherwise could not have built. To a certain extent, I would suggest that we interpret the late 1960s as the point zero of theoretical discourse on architecture and urban planning, as a moment in which emerged a new set of theoretical problems that will be shaping the architectural discourse for many years after. It was a strange moment in which the name architect was in fact a swear word. And this moment gave birth to a new structure of the theoretical field of architecture and urban planning. What I would like to do in my presentation today is, since I cannot go through all the complicated historical details of the 1968 movement, is to broadly summarize what I call a set of consequences of the 1968 movement in architecture, urban planning, and design culture into what I think are the three major effects, which I have called here, first, the encounter of theory of architecture and social sciences. The second, I'll explain that, depth to urban planning. And the third one, the crisis of the object and the critique of then ossified functionalist schemes. In my PhD dissertation defended at Columbia University in 2023, I have worked on the links between theory of architecture and French philosophy, mostly structuralism and post-structuralism, in a rather different, less politicized, and mostly Anglo-American context, focusing primarily on the opposition's generation, namely the people who kind of came after. In contrast, what I'll be doing in this talk is to return to the moment from which this new field of knowledge somehow emerged, even though its political radicalism was somehow lost with, obviously, the rise of postmodernism, and we all know the story. So to talk about the 1968 and the discourse on architecture and urban planning in France, the authors and movements that immediately come to our mind can be Henri Lefebvre, the Situationist movement, and also the group, what was called the Utopie group. Utopie, which I'll be focusing on, was established in 1967 and published a homonymous journal from 1967 to 1977. Although the journal did not reproduce any architecture projects as such, it was initially a unique attempt to unite architects such as Jean Aubert, Isabelle Auricoste, Jean-Paul Hugman, and Antoine Stinko, and intellectuals and theoreticians such as Jean Baudrillard, Catherine Cotte, René Lureau, Hubert Tonka, around a common goal, a contestation of capitalism and of the existing urban environment. In this presentation, I will be focusing mostly on Utopie, and I will rely on the interviews that I have conducted with Hubert Tonka and Bruno Kezan in Paris, as well as on the archival sources linked to the Institut de l'Urbanisme, which I have collected a really long time ago at the Sorbonne and the Centre d'Histoire Sociale. So Lefebvre, Situationist, International, and Utopie. Obviously, these three figures and movements are somehow interlinked, yet there are also important theoretical differences between them. For instance, Debord and Lefebvre were friends until they split. Some say that it was because Lefebvre appropriated Situationist thesis in his 1965 book, La Proclamation de la Commune. And also, we know that Jean Baudrillard, Hubert Tonka, and René Lureau, all three members of Utopie, worked as Lefebvre's assistants at the University in Nanterre. Lefebvre also taught at the Institute of Urban Planning, the Institut de l'Urbanisme, same as Hubert Tonka. However, on a closer inspection, we can also see crucial theoretical differences between these three. In our interview, Hubert Tonka clearly affirms that Utopie disagreed with the Situationist International on the question of political organization, for Utopie was fundamentally interested in the council Marxism, so-called conseillisme, and the notion of workers' self-management. Isabelle Auricoste describes the political orientation of Utopie as follows. She says, I quote, "We were Marxists, but neither Leninists nor Maoists, but rather council Marxists, in the tradition of Rosa Luxemburg's workers' councils." She also notes that Utopie differed from Lefebvre on the question of the possibility to change the society through architecture and urban planning. She claims, I quote, "Lefebvre thought that life could be changed in a way through architecture and urbanism. But in the Utopie group, I think we all very quickly realized that this great urban planning was an instrument of capitalism that we could not change. The architects of the group decided not to practice architecture, but to pursue other means of action. In other words, the members of Utopie were clearly convinced that architecture is always on the side of the ruling power. As Tonka summarizes it in the interview, architecture is always on the side of the establishment. He says, du côté de la Manche, literally, who gives the money. I have never seen an architect leading a protest. So time is flying, and I don't want to get lost in those complexities because this is all just like, as you see, I'm just at the introduction. So let me go straight to my 3 points. So first, the encounter of theory of architecture and social sciences. 1968 can be, to some extent, understood as an encounter between architects and Marxist theory, or social sciences, philosophy, and theory more generally. This is also the reason why French students ask for architecture education to be integrated in the university system. They wanted to bring architecture out of its disciplinary isolation and open it up to a critical reflection on the present. Slogans such as the crisis of functionalism, commodification, the crisis of architecture object, the oppressive character of urban planning, and the right to the city, which appear in tracts, pamphlets, and writings of militants, did not come from nowhere. They resulted from exchange between architects and philosophers. They were related to the renewal of interest in the early writing of Karl Marx and to the overall intellectual climate of the era. For example, Isabelle Auricoste claims that she initially met Jean Baudrillard, René Louraud, and Catherine Cotte at the École pratique des hautes études, where she was taking classes with Pierre Francastel, Claude Lévi-Strauss, and Henri Lefebvre. And interestingly, Effe is also the place where, if you know the Anglo-American theory, Diana Agrest and Mario Gandolsonas were taking the class with Roland Barthes in the 1968. So Lefebvre's dialogues with architects and urban planners obviously helped to prepare the ground for these encounters. And if you want to learn more about it, I can only recommend Lukáš Staněk's older yet still excellent book, Henri Lefebvre on Space, which is really good. When we read theoretical texts published by Utopie, we can see the clear influence of psychoanalysis, namely Jacques Lacan, also the influence of Louis Althusser's structural Marxism, of the Frankfurt School of Rosa Luxemburg, Lefebvre, and so on. In 1968, architects and urban planners wanted to think, and they wanted to think critically. This is why we can understand it as a moment of production of theory. There's an important role of those kind of transmission figures here who spoke to architecture students, organized the contestation, and so on. I think this is this slide. So Bruno Quezan, for instance, he worked with Pierre Bourdieu and Jean-Claude Passeron as a technical assistant in sociology, while simultaneously being a member of the Maoist movement Union des Jeunesses Marxistes and Léninistes. In 1967, he was hired as at the architecture section of the École des Beaux-Arts, where his first seminar, in fact, focused on Marx Capital. Quezan admits that at the time he knew little about architecture, so he tried to transform Marxist sociology into something that could be useful for architects, while focusing on problems such as land rent, la rente foncière. And in 1969, for instance, he gave a seminar focusing on the criticism of the real estate speculation which took place directly in the 18th district of Paris, so-called Belleville. On December 2, 1968, he and Tonka were involved in the occupation of the office of Albin Chalandon, then Minister of Housing and Equipment in France. This occupation took a form of so-called cour sauvage, or savage class, which is in fact a mix of protest, sit-in, and direct political intervention. It included 3 lectures on recently approved standards of HLM housing, on living conditions of immigrant workers in bidonville, the slums, and on deregulation of rents and property speculation, which the protesters gave directly in the minister's office. Meanwhile, students were holding banners: regional planning equals Parisian cancer, slums, and the deportation of farmers. After the fight with the police forces, 8 students were arrested and taken to the Beaujon prison. Another important transmission figure here is Hubert Tonka, which was an important organizer of Utopie. In 1965, he worked as a Georges Candelis at the Georges Candelis studio at the Atelier C, where he, according to his own words, was teaching situationist dérive to students and made them realize projects inspired by the work of the artist Asger Jordan. Another exercise he gives was that he, for instance, invited students to draw a space from memory, a space that they knew, to kind of realize what is the actually memory image of that space. In 1968, he was involved in the strike at the Institut de l'Urbanisme, and he also famously helped to create the Department of Urban Planning at the Centre Universitaire Expérimental de Vincennes. Tonka was critical of structuralism, but as a theorist, he was mainly interested in the city as a site of social production and relatively little in architectural object. I quote him, "We weren't interested neither in architecture nor in the architecture object, anything like that. What interested us was the city, and indeed we were thinking about the city, thinking with words through pamphlets and writing the logic of tomorrow." Some of these documents that show us his thinking and that are quite interesting are those bulletins of the Institute of Urban Planning, Institut de l'Urbanisme, where there was an important student strike movement that took around 2 trimesters. On May 16, 1968, for instance, what we see in those bulletins is that the General Assembly decided that the Institut de l'Urbanisme, the Institute of Urban Planning, should be renamed Institut Autogéré de l'Urbanisme, so Self-Managed Institute of Urban Planning. And on May 20, a General Assembly decided that the director of the institute had no decision authority anymore. So, this is a Bastille moment, basically, of the institution. Simultaneously, there were regular meetings of a commission titled Urban Planning and Society, of which Tonka was a member, and which on May 31st, 1968, as the political situation was becoming more heated, renamed itself Committee for Political Action. So many of the reports from the General Assemblies that took place at this self-managed Institute of Urban Planning show a trace of Tonka. The names cited in the discussion, transcribed partly in those bulletins, include, besides Marx, Herbert Marcuse, and curiously also Wilhelm Reich, which I don't really understand the link clearly. Plus, we can see the clear influence of Henri Lefebvre. In fact, these bulletins show a fascinating intellectual discussion on architecture, urban planning, and society that took place during the uprising at the Institute, and a clear influence of council Marxism and self-management. I'll get to that later. The second effect here, which I have named death to urban planning. In fact, one of the paradigms of the May contestation of urban planning were the critiques of so-called grands ensembles. In 1960s, the real estate market was divided into a private sector and very strong social sector in France. The latter benefited from state financial assistance and was embodied in the famous HLM projects. And obviously, if you know the story, this is historically very much linked to the housing crisis and also the influx of Algerian émigrés to the metropolitan France caused by the war. These ensembles used new methods of prefabrication, and they were often built on a completely new terrain apart from the city center due to easier expropriation of land and obviously opposition of the upper classes to the reshaping of historical cities. In 1968, this criticism of urban planning received a clearly anti-capitalist meaning. Some of this criticism is summarized in the 1969 issue of the journal L'Esprit, titled L'Architecte, l'Urbanisme et la Société. In one of the articles included in this journal, its author Jacques Dreyfus exclaimed, "Once we have succeeded, Alphaville will no longer be confined to the corridors of the Puteaux HLM public housing projects. Alphaville will be everywhere." Thus comparing this new grands ensemble to the famous movie Alphaville by Jean-Luc Godard. And I just juxtaposed in the images this scene from the movie with actually something that has been written on the wall in Paris during the 68. However, this criticism does not date to 1968. It developed obviously much earlier. For instance, Henri Lefebvre's 1960 text, Septième prélude, Notes sur la ville nouvelle, or Seventh prelude, Notes on the new city of Mourenx-Lac, epitomized a similar feeling of crisis. For Lefebvre, this new prefabricated city was an expression of human alienation under capitalism. He describes how, in Mourenx-Lac, the technical structure of the enterprise was projected on the terrain. Inhabitants were classified and divided according to their socio-professional category. And in fact, this is really interesting because this is where this kind of projection of the factory on the territory, this is where it might connect with someone like Mario Tronti and his influence on people like Tafuri and the workerism in general. So in Lefebvre's view, the inhabitants of this new city constituted a so-called new working class, entirely subjugated to the capitalist mode of production. Interestingly, what we see in Lefebvre's text is also a different understanding of the notion of function and functionalism. Lefebvre describes Mourenx-Lac as a sad city without events, a city that's a total functional assembly in which everything is defined by functions that do not necessarily correspond to the needs of its inhabitants. In Mourenx-Lac, everything seems to be monofunctional. Every object signifier resembles a signal, and a set of these objects constitutes a set of the signals. In other words, he describes the city as an oppressive structuralist paradigm. Lefebvre notes that, I quote, the object reduced to a simple signification merges with a bare, stripped-down thing devoid of meaning. Lefebvre describes Mourenx-Lac as a new city without any exception, a city where everything is defined from the point of view of the structure. For him, it is a finite place, a place of alienated and reified life under capitalism. In his writings, the meaning of the word functionalism, which for the left-wing part of the interwar avant-garde signified often a hope for a better future, shifts radically towards social functionalism, towards a tendency to separate and control various social classes. It is not about functional zoning, but rather about the social zoning, namely isolating the poor from the rich. Guy Debord's Society of the Spectacle, which you see here, from 1967 obviously also includes an entire section on territorial domination, which can recall some of Lefebvre's criticism. Debord writes, for instance, that, I quote, while technical forces of capitalism contribute towards various forms of separation, urbanism provides the material foundation for those forces and prepares the ground for their deployment. It is the very technology of separation, end of quote. The members of the Utopie would very much agree on those points. In the first 1967 issue of Utopie, in the article called Outline of a Critical Thinking called Urban Planning, René Louraud denounced urban planners who can only confirm or classify the significations that are already present within the society. According to Louraud, I quote, the urban planner is a good civil servant of the established order. Urban planners merely arrange the city. They objectify it by projecting an order on it that does not take into consideration the social conflicts already present in the society. Urban planning fetishizes the city, I quote, it constitutes a transitional object of critical thinking about the city which lacks a theory of society, end of quote. By opting for merely technical solutions, urban planners block our access to the real of social conflict. In other words, urban planning has no true theory of society. It is unable to invent anything new, and it is always in the service of the dominant power. This criticism of urban planning is clearly visible also in the Bulletin of the Self-Managed Institute of Urban Planning. That's the quote here. A document signed by Tonka includes the following claim, I quote, current urban planning is centralized and dependent on the state. The widespread application of self-management means the ipso facto disappearance of urban planning as a specialized field separate from the totality, that is, as a science and action. The vanishing of urban planning parallels all socialization, same as the self-management involves the decline of the state, which in no way implies the disappearance of urban issues. This would be to confuse the reality with the science of reality, end of quote. In other words, in Tonka's view, the vanishing of the state, in a Marxist sense, necessarily leads us also to the vanishing of urban planning. This, however, does not mean that the urbanity would disappear altogether, for Tonka actually introduces some important distinction here. He says that the urban, what he calls the urban totality, is composed of A, what he calls activité urbanistique, namely urban planning activities, which he describes as a set of institutions dealing with urban issues. Then pratique urbanistique, namely urban planning practice, which he says are urban planning acts effectuated by dominant economic and political structures. And then C, the third point, so-called urban practice or pratique urbaine, which in fact embodies the social relations and which includes also the class struggles manifested in space. Here we get really close to Lefebvre's right to the city. And the examples of which he gives of this urban practice can be, for instance, in France, la commune, an urban uprising, or he says it would be like an illegal occupation of production sites, an appropriation of a specific site by the people, and so on. And he says that basically the consumer society transforms the city in order to better control people. And Tonka claims that the contemporary urban planning destroys urban practice, namely the third point, and tries to make it impossible. In other words, what he wants to get rid of are land ordinances, the rationalization and the projection of order on the territory. He actually curiously even mentions the grid and the land tenure problem, which and its relationship to colonization, which is when it connects with my previous research on the Senegal, by the way. But this doesn't mean that the urban life would be abolished per se. Listen, for instance, what he writes about the modernist zoning, namely the separation of functions on the territory. I quote, "This quest for a rational understanding of urban life, this spatial and temporal division into distinct activities, this impoverished reconstruction of urban practices is one of the repressive structures of the contemporary French society. It naturally leads to social segregation and contributes to the maintenance of class society within an order established by those in power. He says in this case, the expression of the base is replaced by a social command, that of the state capitalism. This is why a brochure published by Utopie in 1969, titled Urbaniser la lutte de classe, or Urbanizing the Class Struggle, literally declared war on urban planning. In other words, for Tonka and other radicals, urbanism or urban planning should disappear in order to make space for a self-managed urban practice. Now let's get to my last and third point, the crisis of the object. So during 1968, a famous slogan drawn on the steps of the Sorbonne, "Cache-toi objet," or hide you object, expressed ambiguities around the question of the object. Compared to the events taking place, objects were seen as despicable things. Another slogan of 1968, written on the blackboard of Sorbonne classroom, "Structures don't go down into streets," alluded to the critique of structuralism and the fact that people and not objects make history. In 1968, many radicals decried the so-called objectification, alienation, and reification of human relations and the fetishism of commodities. Among architecture students, especially in France, this criticism extended to what came to be called the crisis of architectural object. Since it seemed impossible to change society through architecture and urban planning, and radical students were convinced that design was fully complicit in the consumer culture, designing objects would only contribute to reinforcing the already oppressive social structures. This might recall us, the famous sentence of the poet Vladimir Mayakovsky, who once said that during a revolutionary event, a poet has to stamp on the throat of his own song. Básník šlápnul na krk své písni v češtině. Tu báseň. Thus, we are dealing here with an interesting paradox. In 1968, the only reasonable architects were those who did not practice their trade. Therefore, many young architects turned away from design to social science, to studying the sociological aspects of the city rather than producing objects. Even among the members of the Utopie group, a conflict developed between the members who wanted to keep practicing architecture, such as Jean Aubert, Jean-Paul Jungmann, and Antoine Stinko, and who at the time were designing inflatable structures, and more politically radical members who were strictly against designing potentially commercializable objects, arguing that it was more important to fight for the revolution than to design. In fact, the ironic slogan of the 1968 General Assembly at the École des Beaux-Arts mocked this conflict by the motto or slogan, "Are we fighting for the inflatables?" ? This has led to a 1969 split of Utopie into two separate factions, so-called formalists and philosophers. While the formalists, such as Jean Aubert, Antoine Stinko, wanted to continue designing architectural objects, the philosophers, such as Hubert Tonka and Jean Baudrillard, focused on studying the sociological aspects of architecture and articulating a Marxist-oriented criticism of urban planning and design culture. Interestingly, many of the arguments of that period, in many of these arguments of this period, the criticism of design was also closely connected with the criticism of already ossified functionalist paradigm. Jean Baudrillard's famous 1968 book, The System of Objects, is a very telling example in this case. This early book of Baudrillard, I think it was initially his dissertation or something like that, includes some fascinating criticism of design, whose theoretical background shows the influence not only of Lefebvre and Marx, but also of structuralism, semiotics, and psychoanalysis. How does Baudrillard define the notion of the function? He writes that, I quote, "The functional in no way qualifies what is adapted to a goal, merely what is adapted to an order or system. Functionality is the ability to become integrated into an overall scheme." An object's functionality is what enables it to become, I quote, "a combining element, an adjustable item within a universal system of signs." In other words, as in Lefebvre's text on Mourant's lac, the function here is linked to the game of combination, to sort of ossified structuralist paradigm. Elsewhere, Baudrillard writes that, I quote, "Functionality is thus no longer the imposition of the real task, but simply the adaptation of one form to another, as of handle to hand, and the consequent supersession or omission of the actual process of labor." This, in fact, almost sounds like Marx's famous example of the table in the Fetishism of Commodities section of the Capital, which, as soon as it is put on the market, begins to embody the mystical character of the commodity. The fetishism consisting precisely in the fact that commodity reflects the social relation of the producers to the sum of total labor as a social relation between objects, a relation which exists apart and outside of the producers. In other words, for Baudrillard, the supposed functionality of the objects masks the real social relations of labor that are behind them. It is an expression of a repressive social order which replaces the former symbolic values of the bourgeoisie, in the cases like, when the chairs used to be ornamented, by mere organizational values. And this is where, we could compare his argument to someone like Tafuri's argument on Hilbert-Seymour, for instance. So Baudrillard argues that, in fact, we have liberated objects in their function, but we did not liberate the users of these objects, the human beings. And elsewhere he says, "Through an armchair that embraces the forms of your body," here the Knoll chair, "it is the entire technical and political order that you are embracing and accepting." While all this might sound quite far away from our present moment, and we could say that besides tracing the genealogy of the theoretical discourse on architecture and urban planning, that has developed from the 1970s onward, and looking into, for instance, how the political charge of certain terms, such as meaning in architecture, shifted and lost its initial political content, we should in fact ask, how do these 1960 theories speak or can speak to the present moment? Obviously, it is clear that the fetishism of commodities has never been so strong as in the present moment. And with the social media and supposedly inevitable use of the artificial intelligence, which is trying to abolish not only the possibility of the critical thinking, but the thinking of thinking full stop, subject is progressively this subject of alienation is progressively reaching unimaginable proportions. On the other hand, it is clear that in the era of the neoliberal laissez-faire, death to urban planning simply does not have the same political charge as it might have in the 1960s. Perhaps what these 1960s discussions might encourage us to do is to remain lucid about class interests and politics that is hidden in the supposed neutrality of the urban plan. As the irony of the sort, we are here in camp, and we can all ask what, for instance, the soon imposed Prague Metropolitan plan will do to the city of Prague. Activists are already pointing to the fact that this plan risks reinforcing developers' lobby, and that it can have for its consequence a destruction of many smaller green spaces in Prague. In any case, it's being presented as some sort of a salvation from the top, a supposedly neutral expert solution with little space for citizens' participation and comments, připomínky, as if the only possible alternative to the post-communist laissez-faire could be a technocratic solution imposed from above. So, and obviously besides here in Prague, we can also think of the fact that besides starting to have openly fascist undertones, it is clear that the middle-class ideology of the individual car ownership serves in Prague precisely to limit what Tonka would call the urban practice. So perhaps all this might seem really distant, but perhaps we could learn something from those 1960s theories. Thank you so much. And so for anyone who came later, we need your autograph. You're a star, so please sign our prezenční listina. That's really important for the institution. So, yeah. So,
thank you, Jana, for your talk. Questions? And now, my great pleasure to open a discussion.
Hello, thank you very much for your talk, and thank you for the conclusion and kind of bridging to the current state, because my question that has been on my mind while you were talking for a long time was actually I would be interested in your opinion why the maybe framing of architecture was still like very much object-oriented and still is today. And the kind of like reaction was to get out of this, let's say, framing and do something maybe like other than architecture, or why wasn't it more towards like broadening the term, what architecture means, what architecture practice can mean, and also like as I see today, like the object-oriented practice is very much perpetuated through like professional chambers, and it's a yeah, in my opinion, it's kind of like hard to fight it or hard to extend, because also like this whole history of object-oriented practice. So the question would be if there were also like some notions of broadening the term or the content of what architecture is, and what can we learn from it today? Thank you.
So I think that in the 60s it was broadened as much as the architecture almost disappeared, even though then, for instance, curiously, that's what I was working on my thesis. You have this generation, like the opposition's generation of theorists. They all start as theorists, and then in the 80s they go in practice, like people like Tschumi and so on, which, are on the other side of the Atlantic anyway. But you know, I don't say that it's architecture shouldn't be practiced. Architecture should be practiced. I don't have a clear answer to that, because this is like the paradox, right? Architecture is always on the side of power. I am myself someone working in theory and philosophy, so I believe that architecture practice should keep existing, you know, what you call the object-oriented practice, but that we should just open the fields to keep space for perhaps, you know, minority, but different forms of knowledge on architecture that can constitute like a dialectical counterpole, you know, to what's going on in architecture practice. I think that's obviously, you know, I don't know how here in Czech Republic, but if you look at the whole field, like especially in the US, the architecture production, it just got so fast with the digitalization that, you know, we can even ask like how much is a critical thinking, you know, this kind of a Marxist, whatever, how much is it possible when you just have to produce to survive, you know, which is obviously linked also to the, you know, economic situation of the moment and the pressure which many young people are facing right now. So, yeah, so I cannot really give you a clear answer. I just think there should be a space for everything. Huh? I don't know. That's like, I don't really need an you know, I'm an architecture tourist, so why would I need architecture chamber? Obviously, when you're practicing architect, we can ask what those institutions do. You need your building not to fall, you know, but so there's a different form of responsibility, you know. I might have a more social responsibility. So I think these are just different paths, and I just think both should coexist. In fact, especially in architecture schools, it's really important to, you know, to keep some humanities or something that would, so that students can just sometimes stop and ask like, oh, what's going on? You know, why am I doing what I'm doing? That's all, you know. I don't know.
Thank you so much for the presentation. It was very inspirational. Thank you for the notion about the Metropolitan plan. Yeah, I work for an NGO that like commends the plan, Arnika, and so I think this is like very precise description of the state. But I was wondering, because here in Prague we are sort of in like post-socialist context, which also means in the context of spatial planning, urban planning, that there has always been relatively strict role and strong role of urban planning, and nowadays this is somehow being like decomposed in the way of, let's say, maybe like the technocratic or maybe the technocratic nature of the plan itself, because Metropolitan plan mainly presents like a loosening of the rules in order to construct more, and it's also being reframed in terms of housing crisis, etc. So previously, like let's say the plan was more strict, but there was like stronger functional division. But these are like planning details, let's say. So what I mean to say is that we are still having like this very strong structure of like institutional structure of urban planning, including IPR and CAMP, the city as well. But the urban planning methodologies are sort of like splitting or being divided and loosening the rules. So what I wanted to ask you is whether you considered this in like other contexts as well, because like the discussion you described was happening mainly in France. So we have like different spatial planning models in, let's say, Western Europe, France, Germany. And my impression is that this like deconcentration of urban planning and decentralization mainly, even from the institutional perspective, has happened, sort of, like definitely more than in this context. But the goal was sort of the same, to promote like commodification of space construction or space production, maybe. So this is where I'm aiming with the question, like about the comparison of this, that there are like two different ways that are sort of like aiming the same goal. And this is also like, we can contextualize this even with the whole discussion on post-socialism and using like concepts that were being produced by like Western theory and using them in like post-socialist space, which can be tricky, but definitely it can be very well defended because the goal is the same in both cases.
So I'm not an expert on, Metropolitan plan, because partly because the plan is so complicated, right? Because they make it in this way so that, I'm just saying, they make it in this way so that the participation from the inhabitants is somehow limited, right? That's what Arnika has been criticizing, and that's what's problematic, because even this idea of housing crisis, okay, so we have a huge housing crisis in Prague, especially like since the war started, but they kind of always, the official ideology, because the absence of left-wing politics in Czech Republic always says, oh, we'll solve the housing crisis, we'll build more. Yeah, but you're building for whom? When plenty of apartments are being empty or are being used primarily for speculation, what are the statistics? What are the numbers? You're not building, you're building luxury apartments for the rich. So all these questions should be somehow integrated in the urban plan. I'm not sure that's what they're doing, because I think for instance, you ask about France. So again, I'm not an urban planner, practicing urban planner, so I'm not an expert, but as someone who has lived in France for a long time and who grew up here, I can tell that plenty of things that are possible here in terms of monument preservation would never be possible in Paris. That's just unthinkable that you destroy old building on Václavské náměstí to do some stupid commercial center or whatever. It's just unthinkable. So I think that we were very much into this post-communist laissez-faire, which replaced the strict planning of socialism, where all the land was no land property ownership, and we went into this crazy post-communist laissez-faire. And now the plan is being imposed on us like a kind of salvation, oh, finally we'll have some plan. I mean, that's great, we'll have plan, but can you ask please the people who live in those neighborhoods, what do they think about this plan? That's all. That's the democracy we should be striving for. I mean, and that's like the whole political discourse is having a problem with it. It's all those attacks on non-profit organizations and so on. So, I think Mary has a question.
I so appreciated the structure of the talk and the 3 points you made, but I was also thinking, and I'd love to hear your thoughts, of how particular they were to France. In some ways, the urban critique, from a very different perspective, started much earlier, of course, in the US, people like Jane Jacobs, people like Kevin Lynch even, but although we never had the very strong state planning of France. The dissolution of the object, I think you're absolutely right of putting that moment of 68, but it was also true in England without politics. Robin Middleton talks about AD, we hated architecture, anything to get rid of architecture. And we used to joke that Berkeley was talkitecture. By the way, we have this again at Columbia, just as we have object obsession in the market. And the thing of sociology and architecture, again, in the US, but without this political valence, is very common, certainly in the early 60s, before 68. I even think of Princeton having sociologists on the faculty in the architecture school. So I'm just curious about what is particular to France versus other 68 political reactions, like what happened at the States in Berkeley and Columbia, or, as you know well, the German context.
No, so thank you, Mary. So obviously I wasn't saying that it started in 68. That's why I mentioned that the Lefebvre is, for instance, coming much earlier. And as you know, I worked also on the German 68, where actually you have the absolutely similar thing happening in the 68, where I think it's at the Technical University in Berlin, there's a big conference, and then there's a Siegfried Giedon who arrives, and the students, they just put this banner, like, all houses are beautiful, stop designing objects, And in Italy also, it's happening at the time. I'm not sure about the American context, though. I'm sure it probably had some anti-capitalist, moment in the 60s, but, someone like Jane Jacobs, I would hardly consider her anti-capitalist. you know, even though she might be some sort of reformist, whatever. So I think what's specific to France is maybe the strong, really strong political charge. And that might not be only France, that's Germany too, that's Italy too, you know, all these movements are pretty strong.
Well, there was very strong political charge in the US, but I agree with you, Jane Jacobs was hardly a Marxist or anti-capitalist, maybe liberal. But at Berkeley, there was definitely a reaction against design. But I was thinking even of things like Ulm and sociology that had a different kind of political connotation. I think you're right that it crystallizes, but there's very much different. England's reaction against the object was not as highly politicized, in my view.
We should ask if there's someone from the people, because I see there's 40 people listening on Zoom. So please, if you have any question, if you can post it in the discussion and we'll read it right now. No question, so we can take. Yeah, Hilda. She needs a micro. You have one?
So I had a question at the beginning, and I'm going to try to reformulate it. Thank you for the lecture. And this question, how to bring what was relevant from 60s to present, I think is interesting, but it's very problematic because we have a completely different paradigm. It's a totally different milieu, intellectual environment that you touched on, this kind of post-structural shift, this like looking into the margins and what could be the other way of the meaning of things. And we're not in that environment anymore. You know, we're in a kind of late digital environment, and it's different ways of organizing stuff. And there it was like quite clear against the function, against the object. Let's look in the interstitial and find like what's being suppressed to like flip it in some way. So this is where the situationalists and the use of public space were really radical, but we don't have that kind of radicality today because it's a different kind of domain that we're operating in. And so something that I think is like a clue to this that makes it extra problematic as since capitalism developed like that and it integrates its critiques into itself somehow. Now we have, let's say, you can study community planning and public space design and things like that. So in fact, actually what was there, a critique of power, is now embedded inside of the structures of power. And so then it puts into question how to do a situationalist, let's say, critique of public space and power when it's now part of the system. So this is the problem that exists now that wasn't then.
No, and that's what, even it existed then, because the students call it, that's the word récupération, like recuperation. They take our problem partially. They don't take everything we want. They take part of it and they integrate it in the system to say, oh, you know, you had elections, parliamentary elections, so you're fine now, you know. But no, we want more. So I think this discussion existed already then, but obviously that's the problem. That's the anti-dialectical move of capitalism itself, right? That it integrates its negation precisely to stifle protest. I think it's quite funny. I don't know if you went to this show that just opened this week on art and activism in the Městská knihovna library, which is, you know, it's a funny case because I don't want to criticize the show, but in a way, like if you look at the scenography, they kind of replay many of those radical tropes of the 60s. I think they wanted to break the house. But then like you look at the actual content of the protest and they use this vague category of activism and you don't really know what it
Maybe
it
then
means.
towards this, perhaps with all these inversions and integration of negation and stuff like that, then perhaps what would be radical today would be a return to the object as such.
Yeah.
Because we can't overcome the fact that architecture is going to be an object, like it manifests presence, you know, like there it is, kind of. And all the significations that come with it. It's rather a question of how to critically make the object.
Yeah.
You know, so that's...
No, that's a great discussion, you know. I think Hilde has a question and then we should probably go have a coffee or... But I think this is a great discussion. You know, I don't want to close the discussion by some definitive answer. I just want it to be something that every one of you think about.
Yes, I think I'm just repeating something that already came up and what maybe is the background of several questions. This issue of depolitization. You mentioned at a certain point that when theory kind of became Anglo-Saxon, that it was depoliticized. So I would like you first to elaborate a bit on that diagnosis. And then secondly, I'm also very curious, apparently you interviewed many of the actors from '68. How do they look back to that period? Is there a kind of, can you generalize, or are all these memories very individualized, and do you not recognize a common processing of what they did in their youth?
Oh no, that's very funny because, well, I didn't interview that many, but I happen to know many '68 philosophers, so I also met some of these '68 theorists of architecture. You know, generally it's like, on était jeune, on était fou, like we were young and we were crazy. So that's, you know, I think Tonka then worked for Jean Nouvel. So interestingly, because this interview, I did it like, what was it, like 2018, and I never used it because I was like, I remember when I did the interview in Belleville, I was like, oh my goodness, like I cannot use this anywhere. But then actually now when I got back to it, I realized that between the, you know, the kind of juicy jokes that he's making all the time and quirky expressions, there's actually some real content that's hidden in there. You just have to pick it up from there. So, because Tonka runs a publishing house, and I realized that, you know, for instance, when he talks about Clausewitz and Marx, I suddenly started to catch up because that's something I was, you know, for instance, in my publishing house, we're going to publish a book by Balibar where he has this essay on Marx and Clausewitz. So suddenly I could situate him better in retrospect. But I don't think that these people remained like faithful to their '68, you know, politics at all. But that doesn't prevent us from going back to look at them, not about what they're doing now, but what they did then, you know. And for the Americans, the kind of theory. So I wrote my dissertation. Mary knows it. She's my advisor, you know. So she knows it pretty well. On architecture theorists, mostly the opposition's generation, and the links to French philosophy. So I would say that there was some political content, especially in the '70s. For instance, I had a whole chapter on Diana Agrest and you know, Mario Gandelsonas. Joan also knows it. So where I look into how they read Althusser. I think obviously the reading of French theory is pretty eclectic. So, you know, sometimes they mix Christeva with Althusser, like I doubt it works together. But, you know, there was some political charge in this, I would say, in the early, you know, institute years. It's probably not comparable to this in the '60s France, but there was some. But progressively, I would say, my theory is that basically it went from what I call the political politics to the cultural politics. My theory is that, kind of informal theory, is that often the moments I'm interested in historically is where cultural politics intersects with political politics in terms of the embodying of the, you know, the subjective embodiment of, you know, progressive or left-wing politics becomes connected with the traditional structure, like whether it's general assemblies or, you know, parties and so on. And for me, these are generally most interesting historical moments. But I think what happens progressively from the '70s on is that you have this split between, on the one side, the political politics, namely the classic Marxist discourse, and on the other side, the cultural politics that become like this. So obviously, if you meet Bernard Tschumi, I mean, we had this polemics. He totally like feels like he's still faithful to whom he was when he was reading Lefebvre, and he still wears the red scarf, you know. And are those references to Melnikov in La Villette and so on. But I think this, you know, so he would totally disagree. But I think the symptom that we have is really the split between the political and the culture on the one side, whereas the '68 can be read as a moment where the political and cultural, I mean, there's an attempt to really connect them closely. You know, and these attempts often happen during the moments of like big social uprisings, whether, you know, we look at Russian constructivism. Here we have a really interesting generation of 1930s, you know, in the 1930s, non-Stalinist Marxists who, you know, oppose the conservative cultural politics of the Communist Party. So, you know, generally in my research, I'm interested in the moments where, you know, as you said, architecture, the forms speak. So maybe it's not about that we stop designing objects, but we start thinking. about what do the forms tell us and what ideology they embody. It doesn't mean that we're going to stop doing them completely, but we just be conscious of the fact that it's never innocence, that they always have some meaning, you know. So that's probably it. So I think everyone wants to have a break, and me too. So we're gonna have a coffee, and then we'll start in 10 minutes, or what? Did you check the time? Usually 10 to 15 minutes.
Okay, but last question by Professor Hauser, please. No. Okay. Well,
Michael, you tell me on the break. And yeah, and so we have a break. I just want to make 2 quick announcements. If you haven't signed the attendance sheet, mandatory, please sign it. And we also have a book stand at the end where you can buy Hilda's book, you can buy Mark's book, and you can buy my books from Suture Press. It's a publishing house that I run. You have 2 books by Badiou, including my book, which is unfortunately in French, a 10-year project of interviews with Badiou. And there's a book on the 68, effects on philosophy in Prague Spring and May 68 in France, which is text by Etienne Balibar and Jacques Rancière. So if you want to buy a book, come to see me. We have a credit card machine, and there's a little book stand.
okay, thank you.